She was able to perpetrate misconduct for years, until she inadvertently struck a well-dressed black man in court, unaware that he was the judge. Everything she had constructed was obliterated by the subsequent events. So swiftly it transpired. The bailiff, the court reporter, and the defendant, who was anxiously awaiting the proceedings in the front row, were all unaware of the impending event. Officer Tiffany Rourke had just entered courtroom 2B, within the Franklin County Courthouse in Missouri. Her uniform was immaculate, and she clenched her mandible as she always did. She had established a reputation for herself over the prior decade as a person who was authoritative, uncompromising, and not someone who should be crossed. She had been summoned to testify in a misdemeanor drug possession case that morning. However, she was unable to reach the witness stand. She observed a black man who was dressed sharply and was conversing calmly with one of the attorneys in close proximity to the witness box. She charged across the courtroom floor without hesitation and delivered a forceful strike to his face. The sound reverberated throughout the room with the force of a lash. A collective and instantaneous gasp ensued. You could hear the rustle of papers falling and a pen rolling onto the floor. Time appeared to slow down for a brief period. Everyone remained seated in a state of suspension. The individual maintained his composure. He refrained from yelling, lunging, or even raising his hand. He composedly adjusted his tie, wiped his cheek with the back of his hand, and gazed at her in silence. "My name is Judge Antoine Kelly," he declared, his tone being composed and deliberate. "Today I am the judge of this courtroom." The silence was no longer merely a source of astonishment. It was the weight. Excessive. Each pair of eyes was fixed on Tiffany, who now appeared to have ingested a pail of nails. She glanced, at least once, twice. Her lips scarcely moved, as if she were attempting to articulate a sentence. The bailiff, uncertain of his next course of action, trembled anxiously by the door. The young public defender, who was standing nearby, instinctively reached for her phone and recorded the incident in the most discreet manner possible. Several others followed. The moment was captured by at least 4 phones within seconds. Tiffany endeavored to communicate. "I believed that he was not supposed to be." However, it was too late. Judge Kelly addressed the shocked courtroom and announced, "We will be taking a 10-minute break." He then entered his lodgings, completely silent. His expression was unintelligible. The room remained stationary. No one was certain whether to remain seated, stand, or depart. Tiffany refrained from relocating. Her hand, which she had previously employed, shivered slightly at her side. The prosecutor leaned toward her and murmured, "You have just assaulted a judge." Tiffany gazed at him, her face pale, and her eyes blinking rapidly, as if someone had lifted her off the ground. Information disseminated rapidly. Reporters who had been anticipating an unrelated gang indictment case hastened into the hallway. Interns who had exited the room with tremors informed 2 nearby news outlets. The video had been uploaded to social media platforms by noon. Absence of context. There will be no editing. Raw footage of a white police officer in uniform striking a black judge in open court. Most of the reposts bore a straightforward title. "A magistrate is struck by a police officer. He is unaware that he is a judge." Initially, some commentators believed that it was a hoax, possibly staged. But the video was too clean and too chaotic in the minor ways that real life is always. No music is playing in the backdrop. No angles that are particularly noteworthy. Pure tension and genuine emotions. Then the responses ensued. Attorneys, advocates, indicted individuals, each with its own narrative. Tiffany was promptly recognized by a few. Her reputation was known to others. On the other side, Judge Kelly maintained his silence. He refrained from issuing a public statement. He refrained from participating in a live television broadcast. He refrained from threatening legal action. He remained seated behind his desk, perusing the agenda for the remainder of the day, as if it had never occurred. However, it was evident to all others that something had changed. The type of change that is irreversible. However, before anyone could comprehend the subsequent events, they began to pose an alternative inquiry. What was the true identity of Officer Tiffany Rourke? Tiffany Rourke was unknown to the majority of individuals outside of Franklin County prior to the incident. However, she was not only recognized within the force, but she was also dreaded. Tiffany rose rapidly through the ranks. Some believed that the pace was too rapid. She transitioned from patrol to narcotics, and ultimately to a specialized task force that concentrated on high-risk districts during her early 20s, shortly after graduating from the academy. She was recognized with medals, was featured in department bulletins, and delivered presentations at 2 police conferences. However, beneath the headlines and choreographed handshakes, there was an alternative Tiffany, one that the majority of the public did not witness. The beginning was modest. A young black motorist, who was issued a ticket for a broken taillight, maintained that he had never violated the law. Upon his attempt to provide an explanation, Tiffany increased the penalty for non-compliance. Subsequently, he submitted a complaint. It did not proceed. A Latina mother alleged that Tiffany conducted an unwarranted search of her vehicle outside a grocery store. Tiffany responded to her 10-year-old daughter's inquiry by asserting, "You individuals ought to be more knowledgeable." The mother wept as she submitted the report. It vanished within a week. Then an incident occurred that nearly reached the media. A video of Tiffany cursing at 2 black adolescents who were sitting outside a convenience store. She accused them of loitering. She was recorded yelling by one of them. However, the video inexplicably vanished after the boys were apprehended for resisting. Additionally, there were murmurs in the locker facilities of the department, within the ranks of court aides. Tiffany employed obscenities when she believed that no one of significance was listening. She issued threats to subordinate officers who failed to corroborate her claims in the reports, and Internal Affairs discreetly stamped her name as not sustained on every instance in which her name appeared in a complaint. She had acquaintances in positions of authority, including Chief Brandon. He referred to her as a commendable law enforcement officer in a challenging environment. He believed that the public was unaware of the necessary steps to address the issues in those communities. Officer Sam Delaney and his colleagues recognized the impending disaster at an early stage. He once attempted to speak up after witnessing Tiffany strike a suspect's head against a cruiser window. She informed him, "If I filed anything, that he would discover his locker emptied by Monday." Consequently, he withdrew. They all succeeded. Tiffany was the system, not a malfunction or an outlier. Not because they concurred with her, she was it. She embodied the image of power colliding with prejudice and encasing itself in an insignia. It was not solely her actions that were the issue. It was also the arrogance that accompanied her realization that she was untouchable. Jordan Macklin, a rookie officer, lodged a formal objection after riding with her for 2 weeks approximately 6 months prior to the courtroom incident. In the internal log, he stated, "I observed her stop 6 cars in a single day. All of them were black drivers, and were stopped within a 3-block radius. Not a single ticket was justified." 2 weeks later, McLean was assigned to desk duty. Tiffany was awarded a commendation. Tiffany was not the sole issue. Her success in the department was not due to her conduct, but rather as a result of it. Others permitted her to flourish. However, she was already beginning to develop fractures prior to striking Judge Kelly. Old grievances began to discreetly resurface. The leadership of Internal Affairs had been replaced, and the new city council members were less inclined to eliminate the situation. Nevertheless, Tiffany refrained from making any modifications. She, in fact, increased her commitment. She referred to the modifications as political games, and stated to her colleagues at a precinct BBQ, "They cannot affect me. I possess more information about half of this department than they do about me." It was not yet apparent to her, but that was not power, that was a preset. It had already begun to pulse. However, the timer reached 0 when she struck that slap in court on the wrong man, in the worst possible location, and the entire mechanism on which she had depended began to sputter. Judge Antoine Kelly did not close the door whenever he returned to his chambers. He did not hurl any objects. He refrained from shouting. He sat down, exhaled, leaned forward, and reached for the stack of case files on his desk, as if it were any other Tuesday. However, this was not the case. Not for the numerous individuals present in that courtroom. The attorneys, who had encountered their fair share of tension, had never witnessed a uniformed officer physically assault a sitting judge, and certainly not for the individual. Kelly had served on the bench for 12 years, with the majority of that time spent in Franklin County. He was not flashy, did not pursue headlines, wore plain ties, and kept photographs of his wife and 3 sons on his bookshelf. along with a miniature gavel that his youngest son had crafted in the woodshop. However, his subdued demeanor was perceived as significant by those who knew him. He had been raised in St. Peters, Missouri. He was the first member of his family to attend college, and then law school. Before he switched sides, he labored in public defense for 7 years. He had encountered every conceivable type of case, including the trivial, the tragic, and the inexplicable. He handled them all with the same unwavering concentration. He was not unfamiliar with the events that transpired in that courtroom, including the strike. He had been pursued by disrespect for the majority of his professional life. However, this was not a dismissive tone, or a dirty glance. This was a tangible event, the general public. Without a doubt. Nevertheless, he refrained from raising his voice. He had refrained from employing titles. Kelly was opposed to pageantry. Consequences were his conviction. Monique Barnes, his clerk, was transfixed in the hallway, still clutching the folder she had intended to deliver prior to the incident. She entered his office with trepidation. She inquired, "Are you feeling well?" He gazed upwards with composure. "I am in good health. Please take a seat." She sat, her eyes examining his face for any indication of wrath. Monique stated, "I am uncertain as to her intentions. We have the option to file a complaint. The footage is already widely available." He agreed. "We could. However," she inclined her head, "but I am interested in observing their approach." "Do you mean the department?" He folded his palms and said, "The entire system. We should determine whether it remains allergic to accountability." Monique blinks. She was aware of his personal manner. This implied that he would refrain from exerting himself. He intended to be patient, and allow them to raise their hands. Judge Kelly's name was on the rise by midday. He was recognized by individuals due to a graduation speech he delivered at a nearby high school 2 years prior. Quotes were published, and clips were resurfaced. The law is not a weapon. It is a tool. It is the property of all, not just the most vocal. However, he refrained from issuing a statement, or tweeting. At the conclusion of the day, reporters inquired as to whether he intended to file charges. His response was limited to the following: "I anticipate that the system will manage this matter with the same level of professionalism and accountability that I have demonstrated to others over the past 12 years. It was a challenge that was concealed as tranquility, and individuals were able to discern it. In the meantime, the department was experiencing an increasing level of unease. 3 messages had been left on Tiffany's voicemail by the chief's assistant. A discreet inquiry was sent to HR by the county's legal counsel, and at least 2 junior officers had called in ill to avoid being entangled in the brewing storm. Nevertheless, Kelly refrained from exerting himself, as he was not obligated to do so. The footage was more persuasive than any words he could utter. Nadine, his wife, sat beside him on the sofa that evening, holding his hand. She said quietly, "You should have allowed them to escort her out in cuffs." "I desired to," he acknowledged. "However, you refrained from doing so, as it would have rendered the situation pointless." She exhaled. "Do you believe that this time will be different?" He gazed downward at their interlocked fingertips. "I believe that this time." She selected the incorrect individual, in the incorrect location, at the precise moment. However, Tiffany was about to discover the extent to which dignity could be audible when the nation's attention was ultimately focused. Tiffany Rock was placed on administrative leave the following morning. The department's official email was ambiguous, indicating that an incident involving court personnel was currently under investigation. However, the truth was already widely known, and did not require a press release. Overnight, the strike had gained widespread attention. It was being replayed by news anchors. Podcasts examined it. The comment sections were inundated with anecdotes from individuals who claimed to have encountered her personally. A grainy dashcam video from 4 years prior emerged, depicting Tiffany yelling at an adolescent boy during a traffic stop. Her words were slightly slurred, and her tone was menacing. The youngster was released without being charged. However, the recording was never released until now. This time, individuals were not merely conversing, they were attentive. Additionally, her insignia was no longer safeguarding her. Chaos reigned within the department. In the corridors, officers were whispering. Her closest allies,
who had previously engaged in playful banter with her during Friday briefings, abruptly had other obligations when she passed by. A memo from Internal Affairs was disseminated, requesting interviews with individuals who had worked directly under or alongside Officer Rock. Within 24 hours, more than a dozen officers responded. Not all individuals disclosed their identities. Detective Naomi Brennan, one of them, had been delaying her disclosure for nearly 6 years. Naomi informed the investigators that she was once threatened in the locker room, said that I would be reassigned to the county jail rotation if I ever questioned her reports again. An additional individual, who was previously a cadet and is currently employed on patrol, recounted an incident in which Tiffany concealed a flashlight beneath a suspect's seat in order to justify a search. He referred to this as insurance, said that no one would ever review her footage. The floodgates were now open. The smack was no longer the sole focus. That was the catalyst. This was followed by years of smog that eventually ignited. Internal Affairs initiated the process of retrieving her previous reports and conducting a comparison. Patterns were identified, including disproportionate stops, ambiguous justifications, and repeated complaints. In the interim, Tiffany endeavored to regulate the narrative. She contacted a conservative talk show host in her area, delivered a shaky phone interview, and claimed that the judge had made an abrupt move and appeared threatening. It failed to descend. Her typical advocates also took a moment to contemplate the situation. The PR walls were nearly audible, as the host abruptly terminated the segment, stating, "We will wait for additional information before drawing any conclusions." Then her union counsel sent her an email, "I am unable to represent you in this matter due to a conflict of interest." Translation: "You are radioactive." Her inbox was overflowing. Calls were received from journalists. Friends ceased to respond. Even her daughter, Avery, a 19-year-old college freshman, left a single-line message, "Mom, why would you do that?" The once proud medals from her service were prominently displayed above the fridge as Tiffany sat in her kitchen. They appeared to be heavier, as if they no longer belonged to her.
She continued to maintain her conviction that she had committed no infractions. "Not really. He appeared to be a criminal," she murmured, sitting alone at her kitchen table. "He should not have been standing there dressed as he was, and speaking as if he were in charge." However, she was aware that the focus of the matter was not Judge Kelly's attire or political stance. This was about her instinct, an impulse that she never questioned, the individual who had earned her promotions, respect and fear, but never accountability. And now, that impulse had transformed into a wrecking projectile. The Franklin County Police Department conducted a press conference 2 days subsequent to the incident. The chief was accompanied by legal counsel for the first time in 15 years. "We are taking this matter very seriously. An internal investigation is ongoing, and we do not condone Officer Rourke's actions in the courtroom." He did not refer to her as a commendable officer. He did not assert that she had served with distinction. He did not make any statements that suggested he was offering protection. Simply the facts, cold and distant. Tiffany observed the press conference on the television in her living room, as did all other individuals. However, if she believed that the silence from her peers was the worst of it, she was about to discover the consequences when the entire structure she relied on began to break apart, one brick at a time. Tiffany used to stroll through the department as if it were her own. No longer. The few individuals who maintained eye contact did so with a rapid, nervous pace, as if they were apprehensive about being observed in her presence. She had lost her previously unyielding control over the precinct. A kind of awkward vacancy was present in its place, as if someone had removed a distorted portrait, but the nail remained affixed to the wall. The administrative leave was prolonged. There are no answers, no insignia, no paycheck, only passively waiting at home. Her world was rapidly contracting. Avery, her daughter, had not responded to any texts since the night of the incident. They had never been in close contact. Not really. Tiffany had instilled in her a sense of discipline rather than affection. However, the silence now caused a different sensation. She attempted to contact the number once more. "I am your mother. I would appreciate it if you could converse with me." Following the initial call, the telephone line terminated. Tiffany gazed at her phone for an extended period of time before placing it facing down. She had been under the impression for an extended period that she was in control, that the dread of others was a sign of respect, and that the internal complaints were simply the clamor of individuals who did not comprehend the responsibilities of the position. However, she was now adrift in time. As she sat at her kitchen table, her drapes partially drawn to avert the camera van that appeared across the street. Additionally, silence. Although she had not yet been accused, the department was no longer protecting her. The union was in a state of silence. The council ceased to respond. Additionally, additional allegations were made in the background. A petition was submitted by a civil rights watchdog organization, which requested an independent evaluation of all cases that she had handled in the past 5 years. The names of former suspects, former officers, and even a retired judge who remembered Tiffany shouting at a defendant mid-trial, began to emerge one by one. At the time, he dismissed it as stress. She visited the internet to peruse the remarks, purely for the sake of observation. Rourke is precisely the reason why reform is necessary. This woman believed that she was exempt from the law. She interacted with the incorrect judge. Thank God. Then, the most heinous from individuals who professed to be her acquaintances. I have always harbored an unusual sentiment toward her. She was consistently excessively assertive. I recall a time when she laughed after causing a child to cry in an interrogation room. This memory has remained with me. It was not an act of treachery. It was a form of erasure, as if she had never belonged to them at all. Her voicemail was overflowing. Reporters, civil attorneys, and even a woman from a documentary company inquired whether Tiffany would be willing to provide her perspective. The call was not returned by her. She only felt somewhat secure in her garage, where she sat in the vehicle with the doors secured and the engine off. Going through the routines, she would spend hours in that location, rehearsing previous cases in her mind, assuring herself that none of this would have occurred if the judge had simply resigned. If he had not been attempting to create a spectacle. However, she was unable to alter the outcome, regardless of the number of ways in which she contorted it. In public, she struck a male, a citizen who posed no threat, who was not a suspect, who was a judge who was currently in sitting. Additionally, the entire nation witnessed it. Tiffany's neighbor, Mrs. Beasley, who had previously waved at her during her morning jogs, passed by with her dog one afternoon without a single gaze in her direction. She was taken aback by the force of that fleeting moment, erasure that happens quietly, the courteous rejection. It was more distressing than the headlines, because headlines are susceptible to fading. However, the memory of being abandoned endures. Tiffany reviewed an antiquated precinct photograph on her smartphone later that evening. A number of them are positioned in front of the department sign. She focused on her own image, smirking and holding her hand to her hip while wearing eyeglasses. At that time, she believed that she appeared to be quite formidable. Currently, she was only able to observe hubris. However, just as she believed that her descent had reached its nadir, a letter arrived, requesting her attendance at a public hearing. This hearing would expose all of her actions, and compel her to confront the individual who had already dismantled her legacy, without raising a voice. The public hearing was scheduled for 9:30 a.m. on Thursday morning, within the Franklin County Municipal Assembly Hall. The location alone was sufficient to indicate that this was not going to be a discreet behind-the-scenes inspection. It was going to be public. The room was already 3/4 full when Tiffany arrived, dressed in a standard black suit without a badge or weapon. Journalists were stationed along the rear wall, their audio equipment securely fastened to their harnesses. The weight of residents, activists and legal observers caused the rows of collapsible chairs to creak. Judge Antoine Kelly was situated in the second row, behind a line of novice prosecutors. A dark gray suit, calm eyes, and a legal pad perched on his knee were all that was present. No robe. He did not appear to be incensed. He also appeared dissatisfied. He appeared to be an individual who had arrived for work, as if he was there to observe rather than to retaliate. The new public defender, who had reluctantly assumed Tiffany's case, stood beside her, whispering instructions that she did not fully comprehend. The Civilian Review Board, which consisted of a retired detective, a former public defender, a local pastor, a community organizer, and a judge from another county, sat across from them in a long arc of plastic nameplates and solemn expressions. Although this was not a courtroom, it could have been. Miss Loretta Vaughan, the chairperson, initiated the session promptly. She possessed a voice that penetrated the din with the precision of a scalpel. This hearing is not a trial. Rather, It is a public assessment of Officer Tiffany Rourke's conduct, both recent and historic, in relation to her capacity to continue serving in law enforcement. The phrase "continue serving" caused Tiffany to recoil, as if the door was still open, and this was not a funeral for her career. They commenced with the courtroom footage, which was displayed on a diminutive monitor that failed to adequately convey the gravity of the situation, but did not allow for any skepticism. The hall echoed faintly with the sound. Slap. The absence of sound. Judge Kelly's intonation was composed. Then, testimony was presented. Officer Naomi Brennan delivered her prepared statement regarding Tiffany's threat from 6 years ago. She maintained a steady but icy tone in her voice. Subsequently, 2 former arrestees emerged, each of whom recounted how Tiffany's name was included in their documentation, despite her absence from the scene. She had authorized their arrests without providing any explanation. Tiffany sat impassive, eyes fixed ahead, refusing to exhibit any reaction as witness after witness was called. The chairwoman then summoned Judge Kelly to the microphone toward the conclusion of the session. He neglected to bring his legal paper. He did not bring any notes. He simply stood, buttoned his jacket, and spoke. He initiated, "I will not squander the time of this board by rehashing the events that we all witnessed. That information is already public. I am interested in discussing the subsequent steps that follow accountability, as this is the point at which the genuine work commences." He hesitated. Paper was scratched by a few markers. "I have been a public servant in this county for more than a decade. I have observed individuals act recklessly out of fear and react inappropriately due to feelings of inferiority. However, the incident that transpired in my courtroom was not a result of fear or error. It was a reflex that was a direct result of years of unchecked power." He made a slight turn, just enough to meet Tiffany's gaze. "I am not present to disrupt someone's life. Rather, I am present to serve as a reminder to this community of the ideal representation of justice, and to ensure that it never occurs again." After that, he sat. There was no acclaim. There were no responses. Silence. Tiffany's attorney issued a handful of concluding statements, the majority of which were procedural in nature, and primarily sought to secure leniency. It was of no consequence. Before issuing their recommendation, the board briefly paused. Officer Tiffany Rourke was to be irrevocably removed from duty, all benefits would be revoked, and her conduct would be referred to the state attorney for further review. The room deserted, and she stood there, her face empty. People were no longer gazing at her with the same dread or hatred that they used to. Indifference. That may have caused more harm than anything else. On his way out, Judge Kelly passed her. He persisted in his actions. He did not retrace his steps, due to the fact that certain individuals do not require retribution. They were served by the truth. However, the inquiry persisted for an extended period of time after the cameras ceased to flash. What lesson would the community take away from the silence that ultimately compelled the system to listen? Weeks have transpired. The headlines diminished in volume. Additionally, there were other scandals that claimed the headlines. However, there was a change in Franklin County. This time, for genuine, not exclusively in murmurs, not behind closed doors. However, in the manner in which individuals perceived the system, in their mutual gaze. The courtroom, in which the incident occurred, was consistently occupied. As is customary, cases appeared and disappeared. However, the room rose to its feet with a distinct level of reverence when Judge Antoine Kelly entered. I am not referring to his title alone, however, for the manner in which he had managed the situation. He never once sought attention, never solicited acclaim. He continued to perform the task. After a juvenile hearing one afternoon, a young public counsel abruptly halted him in the hallway. "Judge, may I inquire?" she inquired, her eyes darting about. "That particular day, what strategies did you employ to maintain your composure?" He paused for a moment. I was hesitant to provide her with what she had anticipated. Then, he gently smiled, nodded once, and continued to walk. She retained that response, and it resonated throughout the courthouse in other capacities. Officers began participating in revised bias training that was not merely for display. Real teeth were granted to a community council, which was more than just a nameplate and a folding table. Case files from the past were examined. Not all of them,
but a sufficient number to indicate that the doors were groaning open. Tiffany Walk's popularity diminished. She discreetly sold her residence and relocated an additional 3 counties. Interviews are not conducted. There are no public statements. She accepted a position as a private security guard for a transportation company. Her identity ceased to be published in the newspapers, with the exception of footnotes in opinion pieces. There was no redemption arc or recovery. She did not lose everything overnight. However, the sole thing that ever mattered to her was control. She was unable to break the silence that had replaced it. Simultaneously, additional individuals disclosed their experiences, victims of other officers, other incidents, all of whom were inspired by the courtroom's atmosphere. They did not request retribution. They were requesting to be heard. That was its effectiveness. The instant Tiffany's hand cracked across Judge Kelly's face was not solely about that one act. It was the public conclusion of a private pattern, and individuals were aware of this. The department was not the only entity that was shaken by this disclosure. It also disrupted the habits of an entire community in a town like Franklin County, where life is typically slow and tranquil. 2 months later, a woman rose to speak at a town hall. She is older, her voice is steady, and her spectacles are sliding down her nose. She stated, "I am not interested in receiving another apology. I am interested in policies. I desire change that is not contingent upon the release of the next viral video." The individuals in the room nodded in agreement, as they were aware of her intentions. Because this time, they had witnessed the consequences of an individual who believes their insignia serves as a protection from repercussions, and the truth enters the room in a suit and declares, "I am the judge today." This was not a Hollywood narrative. There were no dramatic confessions or last-minute breakdowns. The slow, arduous process of an individual falling from a pedestal they constructed themselves, and the even slower process of others constructing a superior alternative in its stead. The courtroom's walls would never forget the events that transpired within them. It is possible that the impact will diminish. The censors may relocate. However, the lesson persisted. Power, when left unrestrained, transforms into poison. Shouting may be more audible than silence. Additionally, genuine justice does not necessitate raising one's voice in order to be acknowledged. Therefore, what conclusions can we draw from this? Perhaps the character is always revealed when you believe no one is watching, when you feel untouchable, or when the disguise slips in a moment you can't take back. Tiffany's empire was established on the basis of dread. Restraint served as the foundation of Judge Kelly's authority. A seat in the chamber is still reserved for only one of them. Ultimately, that is the appearance of justice. If this narrative provoked contemplation, emotion, or simply prompted a moment of contemplation, please consider subscribing to the channel. We recount the narratives that others are apprehensive about, with the truth at the forefront.